have some sort of system in place that you can rely on, and it's like a process, right? And it's not what we call like vibe testing. Like someone showing up to a client's office saying they have a booked appointment, but there's no appointment. It was so annoying. I mean, like I would pick up my phone every single time. I would call it, I would go through flows, then I would make a prompt change, and then I would have to go repeat the same like 40, 50 calls again.
Welcome to another edition of the Murf AI Webinar Series. Our guest is Rohan Vasishth, CEO and co-founder of Bluejay, a simulation, evaluation, and production observability platform for voice and chat agents. Bluejay has run over 72 million AI evaluations to date and are backed by Y Combinator and Peak 15. They also have a very cool mascot, and you should go to their website to check it out. I'll let Rohan talk a bit more about Bluejay in a bit, but a very warm welcome to you, Rohan, and really glad to have you here. And thank you for taking out the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So, Rohan, you have some big customers like Google and DoorDash. What does Bluejay do for them that probably they couldn't do themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Really nice to be here, and thanks for having me on. Really quickly about myself, started a company called Bluejay. Essentially, we help enterprises, startups, developers test, monitor, and improve their conversational agents. This includes voice, chat, and more. Um, I think the way we primarily do this is through what we call like simulation technology and then production monitoring as well. Um, a lot of times I think it's actually very helpful to like answer your question to have a third party come and do this because it's almost like you're having this like Switzerland um unbiased solution come in and monitor and test all of your conversations, which can be very helpful and beneficial to some of these companies. On top of that, I think, QA testing, monitoring is just all infra that, people sometimes don't like to set up on their own and would like to kind of have a solution that kind of just works out of the box. And I think there's a lot of nuances that, my team has worked on and developed in terms of like features that actually allow someone to get started really easily, but then also go really deep into understanding some of the failure modes, but then also, hey, how do we actually automatically fix some of those problems that we see?
Great. I think we'll dive a bit more deeper into how do you automatically fix a lot of problems. But before that, do you still see, what's the practice that you're seeing today, Rohan? Are most teams still testing agents manually, or are proper testing methods coming into place?
No, I don't think proper testing methods have like made it dominantly across the industry just yet. And I think that's also like largely because AI voice agents or AI chat agents have also not been like adopted prolifically yet either, right? I think the adoption rate is increasing quite a bit, but like if you were to call like you know, a random public number or a phone number of like a really large business, you're probably still hearing an IVR there. You're still hearing like more of that deterministic flow. So I think the testing practices and the monitoring practices are actually getting set in place right now. And it's something that, my team and I, we actually think about a lot in terms of like, hey, like what's the playbook here? And how can we actually give that playbook in an easy and refinable way? That way you can then go and execute on that. Um, I think the really tricky thing with like a lot of these non-deterministic systems is that the playbook is actually much harder to create. So for example, in like the previous age of like more deterministic, voice bots and chat bots, it's actually much easier to say, okay, we have these expected flows. Let me create that workflow. Let me then go and test it. You can then repeatedly test, those nodes and edges and kind of break it down. But I think with a lot of these non-deterministic flows where the agent can branch out into a wide variety of conversations, that is much harder to test, right? And like, how do you actually go about doing that requires a new strategy altogether.
Understood. So there are a bunch of non-deterministic scenarios that an agent can get into. There's a scale problem, and you also spoke about having a neutral party, a Switzerland that can test these things, and hence there is a question of bias. What other places do you think currently testing breaks down? Are there certain ways that in the journey of manual testing, are there other places where you see it breaking down?
Oh, I mean, 100%. I think the basic use case that I like to bring up is like, let's say you're building a multilingual voice agent. Can your tester actually speak all the different languages that your agent is supposed to? Because if they can't, that's just like the clearest breakdown of testing, right? I think a good example of this is actually one of our first customers, didn't speak Hindi, but was creating a Hindi voice agent, right? And, like a lot of people on my team can speak Hindi, but at the end of the day, it's like if you can't speak the language, how are you going to test it manually? And so that's where like that's kind of the first place where manual testing breaks down. There's also just a scale question, and this kind of relates to a personal story of mine, which is like, my co-founder Faraz and I, we were actually building voice agents before Bluejay, and it was so annoying. I mean, like I would pick up my phone every single time. I would call it. I would go through flows. Then I would make a prompt change and then I would have to go repeat the same like 40, 50 calls again. It was honestly just so frustrating that like we decided that, hey, like what if we could click this magical button and like it would just go and simulate and test everything that we wanted for us. And so there's just like a core like with a lot of your workers at your company, right? Their time can be much better utilized, right? Like people don't need to be dialing and like repeating these like scenarios again and again. Instead, they should be equipped with the tools to then utilize that data to then go and fix the actual issues and make it better.
Got it. Got it. So what would be some of you mentioned building your own voice agent and testing it out. Apart from that, what are some of the wildest failure modes that you have seen in voice agents, that the ones that you think or you probably never anticipated when someone built it, but you suddenly realized, hey, this is quite revealing.
Um, there's been multiple. I would say like one really big one is like like someone showing up to a client's office saying they have a booked appointment, but there's no appointment in the actual back office because the tool call, like the agent said it was scheduled, but the actual tool call to like go and place the information in the back end or whatever system was being used to actually book the appointment didn't go through, and so that's obviously like a disastrous sort of uh, output where essentially you've now ended up in an actual business with a appointment, but nobody knows about it. So yeah, that's like an unfortunate one. I think there's also just like if you listen to some of these conversations, like the voice agent can. I think the technology's gotten a lot better, but like I think originally when we were, I remember testing back in like a year ago, it would start spitting out gibberish at multiple points sometimes, like because it would just hallucinate and go off the rails, and so those are definitely funny things to see. I think beyond that as well, like there's been some crazy stories we've heard where like because of like a lot of the way people were building these things originally, it was maybe saying one word that it wasn't supposed to again and again because that's what it was trained on. And so, like, hey, like how can you actually get it to train and say the correct words? This is especially important in the medical field, right? Where, saying like medication names or prescription names is really important. So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting failure modes that we've seen.
Got it. Got it. So when you build a solution, what does simulating a real customer actually look like? How do you
Mhm.
find out these defects before they go live, or how do you replicate scenarios where the agent is either speaking gibberish, like you mentioned, or if a customer comes in with a different accent, there is interruptions, noisy environments, etc. How do you simulate these?
Yeah, absolutely. We have like a pretty robust like simulation engine that we've created. We call them essentially digital humans, where we allow you to actually configure how these digital humans behave. So customers can change, for example, the accent that they talk in. They can change whether there's background noise on a conversation or not. They can change the audio quality of the call. You can change whether your customer interrupts your agent or not. Something that's very popular that you may see if you listen to a lot of customer support calls is people may just get on and say, transfer me to a human, like immediately, right? And you actually want to test for that, right? And see, hey, does the transfer go through? And so you can simulate those types of interruptions too. what if a language switch happens in the middle of a call, right? Like someone's maybe speaking in English and then switches to Hindi, like 30 seconds in, and or switches to Spanish, for example. You can simulate that too on Bluejay, right? So we have a bunch of these like really interesting things that you can like configure. You can make them silent at different turns. So that's like a popular like testing technique of some of our customers is they actually want to make the digital human silent at certain turns um, to see, how certain how their agent responds to those different silence modes. And there's like a bunch more that I can go to, but hopefully that gives you a good idea.
Got it. Got it. So a bunch of simulations there, silence modes, or for instance, the customer changes language. What's probably the hardest human behavior to simulate? Is it emotion? Is it ambiguity? What's most difficult to crack?
You're asking some good questions. I would say like people want to get as close to production as possible, and like it's kind of funny. Like um, I would say one of the things that we was really difficult for us to crack, but we did take a stab at it, and I think we actually did a pretty good job. Was a concept of fluency. So we were working with a language tutoring company, and their customers, have essentially their users are people who don't speak English very well and they're trying to learn a new language, right? And so there's actually a whole like science behind like this like called the Cepher scale where you can like have like level one speakers, two, three, four, etc. And a challenge for us was like, hey, how do you actually simulate that, right? Because a lot of text to speech technologies are not built um, to actually simulate poor speaking, right? They're built to like say and pronounce things correctly. But a lot of the time with these like language learners, one challenge is like, hey, like they actually don't, they maybe mispronounce words, they're slow to speak, they stutter, and so on. And so what my team and I actually did to like recreate some of that, which I thought was like pretty difficult, is we actually modulated and intentionally broke the pronunciation of our simulated humans in certain places to create essentially what we called like very like beginner level fluency, right? Where essentially you could have a synthetic user that maybe doesn't speak English very well. And, to our surprise, we thought this would be very custom to this language tutoring company, but we actually saw some of our other customers start to adopt this too, because they came to us and said, hey, actually, sometimes we have people who don't speak English very well who are trying to interact with our, voice agent or chat agent, and they like essentially want to simulate or recreate that, if that makes sense.
That's great, and it's quite an interesting example. So do you figure this out before it goes into production and you get actual customers on call and you realize they are not the language is broken because they're learning, or you already anticipate for it?
So I think it's a mix of both, right? I think it depends also on the customer that we're working with. If a customer is building, for example, a voice agent that's never been into production and they don't even have, for example, like conversational agents or IVRs or historical conversations of any point, then the work becomes a little harder, right? Because we actually have to like manufacture synthetic conversations essentially out of thin air, based on the likelihood or the context of your conversation. Now we're still able to do this because I think AI is a very powerful tool, and we're able to auto generate these like really good scenarios that are likely close. That being said, we do recommend our customers to also mine their production conversations and data. And the reason for that is because that is the conversation that you're optimizing for, right? At the end of the day, the production conversations that you have are the best source of data for how your simulations should also behave. And to that point, we essentially have that replay from conversation feature that allows you to build it in. So I would say it's like a mix of both, and it depends on the customer, right? For how we create these simulations and whether we leverage the production side of things or not.
Got it. And that brings me to my next question, which is, when do you test? You test before you take it live and also during production. And if you can elaborate a bit more on how production monitoring is a completely different problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, I'll tackle the first part of that. So in terms of like when do you test, I would say the best companies, in my opinion, test quite frequently. We actually have some companies that, at least at the start, they actually had more simulation minutes than production monitoring minutes which was interesting to see. That typically doesn't happen, by the way. But I think that is indicative of a company that's really taking a lot of their pressure testing very seriously. In terms of like when you test, I would say definitely every time you make a code change or a prompt change in your agent, you should be running a certain set of regression tests. And by regression tests, I basically mean a certain set of tests that are essentially making sure that existing functionality is working as it should. Then what you should also do is you should probably run tests related specifically to that change. So, for example, if you added a new flow into your conversation that you want to test, um, you should likely test that as well. So basically, one time of testing is every time you make a code change. And you can also do this via CI/CD, for example. That way, it's programmatically run every single time. Another type of testing that I think is really popular with some of our customers is what we call like a heartbeat test. So when you release these essentially voice agents, if you guys have like heavy traffic or if you want to make sure that your business is staying up consistently throughout the day, it actually may be very helpful to run what we call a heartbeat check. So this is essentially a simulated call that gets run against your production line, every 5 minutes or 10 minutes of the day or whatever frequency you want and make sure that your line is actually staying up. Or make sure that the API calls that you care about or the functions that you care about are staying up. The benefit of doing this is essentially anytime something goes down, you can get immediately notified, potentially before a customer, before it hits a customer. So this can be a very proactive way for you to go in and make sure that any fix happens throughout the day. I would say some of our larger enterprise customers are very adoptive of something like this because they just want to make sure that they're always up and that there's no downtime. The final type of testing, kind of outside of those two modes, I would say is what we call just like standard load testing. If you guys are revamping or, want to run one every quarter, essentially we do recommend running some sort of load test that's typically 15% higher than your peak production traffic to make sure that you can consistently handle any spikes that may happen throughout the year. Avoiding cold start problems, infrastructure issues, API issues, and so on. But yeah, I think that hopefully answers a little bit about like when we recommend to test. And depending on your company and stage, you may choose all of them, some of them, etc.
Great.
Happy to answer also the second part.
Great. That's quite comprehensive, Rohan. And yeah, one of the things that we keep hearing about, or one of the conversations you keep hearing about, is silent failure. So, what does silent failure actually look like in a voice agent, and how would a team know that their agent is degrading?
Yeah, I think so. When you mean silent failure, there's a couple. I think there's a couple meanings that can have. One, silent failure can be literal silence within the voice agent, or it can also be like a silent failure that's happening where mentioning like the example that I had before, where like, hey, something was scheduled, but the tool call is failing under the hood. Which one of those did you mean?
I mean the latter. Yeah.
The latter, yeah. That's a huge, huge issue that we see. And I think it's really important that whatever eval system, like whether you're using a system like Bluejay or something else, whatever eval system you're using, I think it's really important that you're capturing all the tool calls and the traces related to that conversation. And the reason for that is because I think there's been a lot of like the idea of conversational monitoring in QA has existed for a long time, right? A lot of people have been monitoring conversations for CSAT and NPS. You look at the transcript and the audio file, NLP models, you are able to extract different information. However, that eval technique no longer works for AI agents because AI agents are far more complex, right? You have function calls that are happening under the hood, depending on like the context window and like how long the conversation's been going on for. The agent may, to your point, degrade throughout the conversation, literally. And depending on how you've set up your agent, right, it may also degrade sooner, right? So agent design here is also very important to avoid some of these issues. Um, but essentially, I think it's something that we see a lot. And having a system in place that has knowledge of what tool calls are happening under the hood alongside what is being said on the conversation, and then making an appropriate evaluation with bias towards the function calls is typically really important.
Understood. Got it. Got it. So we spoke about simulation, we spoke about testing pre and post production.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about building testing into the pipeline. So do you test each layer of the stack independently, like STT, LLM, TTS, or you start backwards of a full conversation and then dive deeper basis where there's a problem or not?
Yeah, you can do it in both ways. I think what we like to recommend is you test the whole system, kind of like from the bat. I think the way we break it up is we can actually say you can do a lot of text-based simulations against your model, right, or against your agent in a text format to get really, really quick understanding of functionally how your agent's operating. Right. And so what that can do is like text-based simulations typically like can be a lot faster, and they can be a lot cheaper as well. Um, and so you can do kind of that whole process really, really quickly, get a good understanding of what's going on, and then you can move over to voice-based testing, which would allow you to cover the SCT and the TTS side of things as well. Um, so that's kind of how we recommend breaking it down. To your point, you can also now go further here and say, hey, like let me actually go test the individual SDT. Let me go test the individual TTS. And I think there's like either, benchmarks that you can use or like playgrounds where you can essentially play around with like how the voices sound or how the transcription quality is for your particular conversation for you to get like a good idea of what works best for your use case. But in general, we do recommend testing your whole agent instance where you can either start with text and then upgrade to audio or just go audio first from the beginning.
Got it. And you touched upon this earlier, which was when you push an update to a voice agent, say a new prompt or a model change or a new feature, how do you make sure that you haven't broken something that was working before, and make sure that the number of test cases also don't keep compounding every time you push an update?
Um, yeah. So what we recommend is like you want to essentially, in an ideal way, you're not doing this in a spreadsheet and you're not doing this manually, right? And so if you're using a tool like Bluejay, you ideally want to build up that library of what we call them digital humans, but like test cases over time. Um, I would recommend like combing through your test cases and actually making sure that you're not bloating it to kind of your point, right? To a point where you're maybe running 1,000 test cases where like some of them are just not needed or they're like overlapping in some way. So you can use AI to like manage the test cases or also like have like a human in the loop to like make sure that you're not exploding out there. But in general, we do recommend that you do maintain that regression suite and consistently add to it as well as you add new features. I think that's really, really important to make sure that essentially you have a really solid foundation as you kind of build up that library and as you build your voice agent. And this is something that doesn't happen from day one. It's something that happens, over time as you learn more about your agent and how your customers, behave and experience it.
Got it. Got it. And the next part I want to get to is in terms of industries, compliance, regulations, etc. And as builders of voice models, we've seen firsthand how the kind of voice compliance systems, regulations can vary quite a bit from industry to industry. And sometimes those become more important than, like, say, latency or other things. And how does it work at your end? Does the industry the voice agent is operating in change how you test? Then how does one even test for things like compliance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the industry changes a lot of things, right? In terms of like what you want to test for and what you want to essentially monitor for. So, for example, BlueJay works with healthcare and financial services companies. Even across those two industries, you'll see very different types of evals or very different types of things that people are testing for. That being said, it's not to say that, there's no overlap. There definitely is some overlap, but I would say it does vary. If you go into a completely separate use case and you look at like retail or customer support or like services or drive-through or restaurants and stuff like that, it also changes quite a bit, right? In terms of like the evals that you're running, the types of simulation testing you're doing. In the drive-through, for example, maybe you care a lot more about background noise, right? Because these orders are happening outside, it's typically a noisy environment. So the way you test and also what you monitor for changes a lot. Um, but in terms of like compliance across financial services and healthcare, absolutely it differs. And things that you have to be aware of, change based on like those regulatory environments. And I would go even further to say, like, even if you go into healthcare is such a large industry. Like different healthcare companies will care about different things, different financial services companies will compare about different things. Even if you looked at like two companies that do relatively the same thing, even those companies may care about different things because, you know, people just end up wanting to observe for or monitor, essentially they have different concerns that are more relevant to their business. And being able to translate those effectively into whatever eval system you're using is really important.
Got it. Got it. We have a lot of people building voice agents in the webinar today, Rohan. And if you had to give
Mhm.
one piece of advice around testing voice agents, what would it be?
Book a demo with Bluejay. I think that would be the best advice I could give you. On a more serious note, I think having a system in place that you rely on with some sort of structure is very important. Regardless of whether you use Bluejay or not, have some sort of system in place that you can rely on. And it's like a process, right? And it's not what we call like vibe testing. Right? Like don't pick up your phone, you call it 3 times, you're like, okay, it somewhat works. Let me deploy the thing into production, see how it goes. That is not a recommended process. In general, we would recommend having some sort of system, whether it's manual or automated, right? Our recommendation is you have a more automated system. But I would say defining that structure is really important. And I would say leveraging existing data to create that initial testing bed, is also a recommendation. On that point, I would also say eventually you do have to go to production. So having a good monitoring system in place that's able to surface issues, and kind of help you refine not only your agent, but also your testing infrastructure, is really important as well. So I would say the biggest advice I have is make sure you have some sort of system in place that allows you to kind of do these components more scalably.
Got it. Got it. And what's your bold prediction? What does the voice agent space look like in 2 years from now? And what role
Yeah.
does testing play in getting there?
Um, I'm actually like, I think like slightly, I don't know if this is a controversial take or not, but I think voice AI is a really cool technology. We're very bullish on it at Bluejay. I think it's going to have like a lot of like great impact, but I think the focus should not necessarily be on voice AI. It should be on, hey, what the voice AI is trying to do, which at the end of the day, you're trying to automate some sort of task that someone is trying to get done. And so, in my opinion, the focus or where kind of voice AI is headed is it's actually headed a part of this like larger orchestration system to help tasks get done for the end consumer, right? And so that may mean more adoption of voice. It also may mean like, hey, people start to use other things like an API call or an agent that goes and completes a workflow, with like the goal of initially or just getting that task done. And so I think like my prediction is that voice AI will become more predominant, but become a part of a larger ecosystem kind of aimed at automating some of these larger tasks, which may not always be voice driven, right? And so in terms of like where testing and monitoring plays in this infrastructure, I would say it's a very multimodal future. Even today, we believe that we don't only advertise for voice, we also advertise for chat. But we believe in kind of being that testing and monitoring bed for any sort of conversational agent, that's able to tell you, hey, how are these things performing? Are they performing well? And kind of forming that trust layer. And I think that trust layer will be very important to see this adoption actually go through. Otherwise, enterprises are going to be very hesitant to essentially deploy these into production.
Got it. Got it. I think these are a bunch of questions I had. And I think while we're speaking about where's AI voice headed, it's a good place to segue into some of the questions that the audience also has. And in no specific order, something that follows directly from my previous question, which is what's the future of AI voice agent testing methodologies? Or where do you see AI voice agent testing heading especially considering the high cost of iteration, high cost of training?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I think I mentioned this a bit before, but we actually say you can get a lot of testing done text to text, right? No, so this also depends on like the whatever becomes the predominant way in people deploy agents, right? So right now it's a very like cascaded way, in which case you can do that like very quick, rapid iteration of like text to text cases. And so I actually do recommend that people do that. What that allows you to do is it gives you very fast iteration because the text cases happen much quicker. It's also much cheaper to do, and you can do much more of them at scale. That being said, we still do recommend you do like 30 to 40% on the voice side after that. And the reason for that is because we often see failures on the voice side that just aren't surfaced in text. And you may be surprised to see this, but there also include functional failures. And we've actually seen this ourselves. We've seen this with customers, and it's always a big surprise. And I think it's important that, companies do both, but it can definitely be a good place to start out with that tech side of things to, like, as you mentioned, give you kind of a cheaper and quicker access to insights and a faster and tighter improvement loop.
Got it. Got it. Another question we have from Kane is, when testing ASR systems for phone calls with a lot of background noise and acoustic conditions, how can teams meaningfully act on the results to improve performance? So there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of background, there's a lot of acoustics in the background. How can teams probably act on the results? This goes beyond testing, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes into kind of this like idea of like, okay, it's great. You found like all of these issues in my system. How do I now actually go and fix them? And so that's actually something that Bluejay has started helping our customers out with too. We call it essentially like a self-healing or a self-improvement loop, where we can use simulated data or production data, spin up like a coding agent via our MCP, and then actually go and fix some of these issues for you, right? Or make the prompt changes or the code changes. When it comes to ASR specifically, there's quite a few things that you can do to tackle that. There's a few companies that do a lot of great work on essentially like denoising, right? And kind of like making the audio a little cleaner. That way, like your ASR technology can pick it up a little better. Um, there's also other things you can do like around like key term boosting and stuff like that that's come out. There's new like promptable SDTs that also exist, which are like pretty cool, that folks can take a look at. That way you can actually use AI to like sort of make your transcription a lot better, if that makes sense. So there's a few different techniques that you can kind of dive into and explore there.
Got it. Got it. Another question we have from Abhyang is, in outbound use cases, especially for sales first bots, what are some early stage metrics teams could focus on, I believe, to make the bot more persuasive without it overselling? Is there a way to test for that?
Sales is a very tricky use case. We actually like one of our earliest customers is 11x, which does a lot of sales voice agents. So we've actually spent a lot of time with them in this space. Um, it's tricky. Is the short answer, right? I think sales and being persuasive is very, very tricky. If you look at the best salesperson, like if you go into like a company and you look at like an AE who's just crushing it and you like listen to like one of their conversations and how they sell the product, what you'll notice is a lot of sales is actually not even in what you say, but it's in how you say it. So for example, like the intonation of someone, right? Like when I choose to pause, when I choose to say something, like all of those things are actually so important in selling, which people don't realize, which I think creates like, a perception of confidence. It creates it creates a perception of confidence that's really important. With regards to how I would do this is I would set up some sort of flag post metric that you really care about, right? So for example, in an outbound sales use case, maybe that's like the number of booked meetings you're getting, right? So essentially your conversion rate to a booked meeting. And what I would essentially do is I would actually use production monitoring to essentially A/B test this. And this is something you can do really neatly in Bluejay, but I would essentially have it so that, hey, let me actually track two different versions of my agent, right? So version A could be a TTS that has one accent and performs in one way. And version B could be a TTS that performs in a separate way. And you can, use a bunch of different strategies to try and change the intonation of the way certain things are spoken, or change, how quickly they say something, or what type of voice you use itself, and then track essentially, hey, how is my conversion rate performing across these two different versions in production? And the benefit of that is you move from once again like a vibe based, hey, I think this sounds more salesy, to like, okay, actually, what is converting for me? And I would say this same technique that I just mentioned applies to, I think, a very common question we get asked is, what TTS is the best? What voice is the best? And I always respond by saying, hey, I actually can't answer that for you. The people at your company, unfortunately, probably can't answer that correctly either. The only person that can answer that is the data by actually deploying this voice agent and then tracking it against some KPI that you care about for your business to see which TTS is performing better.
Got it. Got it. You spoke about intonation and you spoke about checking which TTS is performing better. So, as voices get more natural, there's a question around how natural should an AI voice sound? I think building backwards of that, is there a definition of how you test for naturalness or what customers define as naturalness?
This is a really good question. I would say the naturalness is so subjective. I think oftentimes I actually don't think this is the right question to be asking, where it's like, hey, how do I make my voice agent more natural? Because at the end of the day, the reason you're asking that question is there's probably something in the conversation that you're not happy with. This, by the way, can range from things like latency to interruptions as like the very baseline metrics, right? So, for example, if you have a very high latency, it's probably not going to be sounding like a natural voice agent, right? If it's taking a lot, or a natural tone, right? And so the first thing I would say is, hey, like, let's actually take this concept of naturalness and let's tie it to specific things that we think can make it sound more natural. And so one of these things, for example, very base case is latency. So let's go and optimize the latency. Another thing is like kind of interruption handling. So like, how does your voice agent kind of like barge in? Does it barge in when customers talking on the other line? And how can we minimize that or make those barge ins, more natural themselves, right? And so that would be kind of like another thing that I would tie to this concept of naturalness, right? And say, hey, let's actually optimize those base things first. And I think actually you'll see a lot of improvement in your quote naturalness of your voice agent if you get those two base level cases right. The third thing I would say that I think people should focus some time on is, yes, the voice that they choose. I think that's very, very important, right? And so the voice that you choose does correlate with how natural it sounds. But the adjustment that I would make here is that it should not be the developer that's going and listening to voices in a web UI and trying to determine which one sounds better. It should be that data-driven way that I was talking about, right? And the reason for that is because you're then able to track it and actually understand, hey, is this functioning for my customers in the most natural way possible, if that makes sense.
Got it. Got it. That's clear. The next question we have is from Karan, who's asking about how can teams effectively test tool calls and voice agent simulations. We spoke about this briefly. We spoke about a failure mode, but is there a reliable way to mock tool calls during testing?
Yeah, absolutely. You can like intercept the tool calls as they're happening and like mock the responses essentially to make sure that you're actually not hitting your production tool calls. I would say like the answer to this depends a lot on how you've set up your system. That being said, at a base level, what you can do with like Bluejay, for example, is you can import all of your tool calls into our platform, your traces. This can be done either programmatically or we have a bunch of no code integrations with tools that you may be using. Um, and so you can get your tool calls and your traces really easily into Bluejay. And then you can go and test them from there. What we recommend is you have some sort of dev or staging environment that you can like play around with, right? And so you can maybe let the tool calls actually function as they should. Alternatively, yes, you can also mock the tool calls, right? That way you're essentially intercepting that mocked tool call and making sure that you like return a response and allow the conversation to go on as it should. So yeah, it's very, very important.
Got it. Got it. Abhishek has a question and goes back to the point around maybe intonation that you were making. Can we test voice modulations of agents? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, so this would be like, if I'm understanding correctly, like changing like how maybe loud the voice sounds or how soft it sounds, if that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is something you can tweak and like from a simulation perspective, right? You can change how loud or soft the voice is. You can change for what it's worth, how fast or slow the voice speed is as well. So you can play around with a lot of these things to like essentially change that. Kind of going into an example that I was mentioning before, you can do a lot of interesting things with the way like different TTSs are built by changing, like for example, there's this concept of like SSML tags. Right. So you can actually like go in and change the way certain words are pronounced as well, to really produce high fidelity simulations, and conversations that yeah, that you would essentially expect.
Got it. Got it. We have one more question from Jyoti. Can voice agents determine a caller's location based on the country code of their phone number? I'm not sure if it's testing specific, but yeah, that's the question. Can they determine the country code basis the phone number?
Yeah, I mean, you can do a lot of things based on the incoming phone number, right? We have customers who look at the incoming phone number and they'll actually do a lot of prep work for the conversation before it actually even starts. And by the way, this can be like a great way to reduce latency as well, right? So you can actually preload a lot of information about the customer through their phone number. That way, your agent has it in context and doesn't have to make tool calls throughout the conversation. So I would say yes, you can do the country code, but you can actually go in and do a lot more based off of that as well.
Got it. The question we have from Lokesh is, have you experimented with jargon libraries for vertical specific voice agents? How do you manage and update them? I think it's about STD or TTS. How do you handle jargons for vertical specific agents?
Gotcha. When you mean jargons, are those like, is that like truly just like, hey, like a customer says just like random stuff, or are those like specific words that are unique to that industry that are maybe like hard to pronounce?
I think the latter. I think it's
Okay.
specific words unique to pronounce or acronyms that might be, say, BFSI specific and things like that.
Gotcha. And is the question like, um, when you say how do you handle this, is that like, hey, how do I build a voice agent that's able to like handle some of these words correctly and like say some of these words correctly? Or is the question like, hey, how do I, yeah, is that the question essentially?
Yeah, I think
Yes.
Look,
Okay.
if you can update the
Yeah.
what were you asking?
I
Yeah.
I think you just said yes. So there's a few things you can do. A lot of you can once again train your SD or your TTS to say some of those words specifically um, and correctly. And so one thing you can do, kind of what I was saying is like a lot of TTSs will allow you to actually control the pronunciation of specific words. So in your voice agent pipeline, you can actually set up a process so that if you detect from the LLM portion that some prescription name needs to be said. That's really, really complicated to say. What you can actually build into your system is you can actually wrap that specific word with an SSML tag that then allows you to actually pronounce that word in a very specific manner for like how you care or how you think it should be pronounced. This can allow you to get that exact pronunciation that you care about in the conversation.
Got it. Got it. Understood. I think we are on time, Rohan. That was a fantastic conversation, I must say. We still have a lot of participants highly engaged and asking a lot of interesting questions. And this is the kind of practitioner-led discussion we set out to have. Thank you for walking us through a solid framework for testing voice agents. Thank you for diving deeper into the challenges and making sure you left us all with real actionable solutions. And
Yeah.
a big thank you to the audience also for joining in and asking a very engaging set of questions. You'll receive the recording of this webinar on your mail ID, and that's all we have for today. Thanks a lot, Rohan. Thank you for your time again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, and to everyone here. Appreciate you guys joining, and Murph for setting it up. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, regardless of whether you want to use BlueJay or not. Would just love to answer them. Feel free to email me if I didn't get to your question. Happy to answer it offline as well.
Got it. Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Rohan. And this is Sundar from Murf AI signing off. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.